Well, we're back into our series on cults and the occult. We have briefly looked at Judaism, really a brief overview of Orthodox Judaism, Conservative and Reform Judaism. We've also had a lesson on Chabad. Gave you a little information there. Well, for the next two lessons, I want to focus on Kabbalah. Some pronounce it Kabbalah. At any rate, Kabbalah is certainly not easily defined. It's not as if you can go to one book to which is centered on that particular cult. How about that? Kabbalah isn't even really a belief system. It is hard to explain. I will tell you, it was several years ago while driving through Boca Raton, and I had the radio on, and there was a commercial on the radio for Kabbalah, whether it was a conference or wherever it was going on. And the commercial admitted by saying, I remember the words, Kabbalah is not a religion. That was in the advertisement on the radio. Kabbalah is not a religion. Okay, well, if it's not a religion, then what is it? Well, Kabbalistic teachings speak of multiple realms between the three-dimensional physical world we reside in and the quote-unquote Godhead at the top of the tree of life, representing enlightenment and full consciousness. So, again, when we use the term as believers, Godhead, we think Father, Son, Holy Spirit. That's not what Kabbalah is saying. It's enlightenment. It's full consciousness. According to Kabbalah, you have what is called, of course, the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses. We understand that those first 5 books are a divine revelation from God given to Moses, and he wrote those 5 books down. We read the Torah, we study the Torah, we want to learn more about God. Kabbalah is the occult of the Torah. Kabbalah is the secret interpretation of the Torah. Kabbalists will tell you that their teachings were orally handed down for centuries and centuries until it was eventually written down in the 12th century. Kabbalists will tell you that contained in Kabbalah, you can gain access to God's power to change your life and the world. Now, there are a number of different sects, sects, in Kabbalah. We will be discussing 2 of them. There are many more, and really the different sects do not agree on a number of things. It's more or less like in the world of Judaism back in the Second Temple period. You had the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they would oftentimes discuss matters and dispute about certain things and so on and so forth. But Kabbalah will tell you that even though we have the Torah written by Moses, is that nothing that Moses wrote should be taken literally. Kabbalah will say that everything that Moses wrote should be taken symbolically or allegorically. Now, when I went to look for information on Kabbalah in my library of books, of course I've quoted from Dr. Walter Martin a number of times because we're in a series on cults. And so I went to his book, Kingdom of the Cults, and I did not find Kabbalah in that book. I did find it in his book, Kingdom of the Occult. That should tell you something. He has an entire section in that book, Kingdom of the Occult. And in it he writes, the wisdom of Kabbalah was written about events and ideas from the world above, not the physical world known as the world below or earth. Only by studying it correctly can one hope to ponder the mystery of godliness, for it is not possible for God to know man or for man to know God on this earth. He can only know what God is not. End quote. So Kabbalah will tell you that Abraham, in essence, never really knew God. The best he could do was he knew about God, or he knew about godliness. But that's not what Paul says in Acts chapter 17. If you recall Acts chapter 17, he travels to Berea, he goes on to Athens, and then he delivers a sermon on Mars Hill. And in that message, what does he say? He says, "For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and exist." Notice Paul said, he is not far from each one of us. Kabbalah will tell you he is. In Dr. Martin's book, in discussing the philosophy of Plato, he goes on and he explains, in order for humans to reach the knowledge they needed to learn, it was necessary for the mind to access divine knowledge already present within each human being. Knowledge gained from a soul's previous life. This previous existence would eventually become known as reincarnation. And if you recall in our lesson on Chabad, I told you that's what Chabad believes. They believe in reincarnation. That you are ascending, you're ascending, and there was even stories of the Baal Shem Tov as he's delivering souls out of animals that used to be Jewish souls, and so on and so forth, in a previous life. Kabbalah teaches reincarnation. Kabbalah does not believe in a bodily resurrection. In Kabbalah, you are attempting in your reincarnation over, and then the next one, and then the next one, and the next life, and you are climbing the tree of life. And you're trying to climb the tree of life to get back to God so that you may return to paradise, or even you may return to Eden, they would say. So what does the Apostle Paul have to say about this notion of reincarnation? Well, he says in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 38 and 39, "But God gives it as a body just as he wished, and to each of the seeds a body of its own. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one flesh for men, and another flesh of beasts, and another flesh of birds, and another of fish." You have been created by God. There is no such thing as reincarnation. You've been created by God as a human being. He creates human beings. He makes fish. Fish are fish. Birds are birds. Cattle are cattle. Angels are angels. There is no reincarnation. Henry M. Morris writes, "The doctrine of special creation means that creation took place by supernatural processes, and that each created entity was specifically planned and formed by God. This doctrine is clearly taught in the Genesis record, where the phrase, quote-unquote, after his kind, is used no less than 10 times in the very first chapter, end quote. So not only does that, as Mr. Morris said, not only is there no such thing as reincarnation, there's no such thing as evolution. Now, every human being, all of us at some point in our lives, we're going to ask the question, who am I? What am I? teenagers trying to, they're not little kids anymore, but they're not adults either. Why am I here? What is the purpose of my life? Every human being asks that question at some point. Kabbalah teaches you that as an individual, you will never be able to answer those questions. You will never be able to answer the questions. There is no single book that can help you. Your only hope is that you must be taught by a Kabbalistic rabbi. Kabbalah will teach that, yes, there is the Torah, and remember, it's not to be taken literally. So there's the Torah, but you can't understand the Torah without the Talmud. Then they take it a step further. Well, you can't understand the Talmud without the Zohar. And the Zohar was written by Moses de Leon. And it's rather suspect as to when it was written. Probably later on, 13th century. He died in 1305. He probably wrote it sometime in his 40s. But Dr. Martin writes, he says, the Zohar is a difficult read for some people and incomprehensible for most, since it is written in what is called the quote-unquote language of the branches, a philosophical language, rather than a cultural one, such as English or Spanish. For example, the majority of both Jews and Christians would agree that Genesis 1 reveals actual physical details of the creation. Kabbalists would say that in the quote-unquote language of the branches, Genesis 1 has nothing to do with creation at all. Kabbalah focuses on the interconnectedness of the world above with the world below. And the quote-unquote language of the branches is key to understanding who God is and what His purposes for this world might be. This is the secret Torah. End quote. Now, we'll get to that in a second. So the God of the Kabbalists is transcendent. In other words, He cannot know man, and man cannot know Him. He cannot know human beings because Kabbalists would say if He did, then He would cease being God. And so what we have is what they define, or they term an Ein Sof. Ein Sof, which means without end or infinite. And so that God, in essence, the best way I can explain it is created another God, perhaps. That God is not a He, that God is more of an it. Now, we know God. Of course, God is spirit. That is true. But God reveals Himself to us in the masculine, and He does so throughout the Scriptures. And when He does so, He reveals Himself in the masculine as a father, meaning there's protection there. He gives us provisions. When Yeshua was asked, how do we pray? What did Yeshua say? Our Father. Yeshua prayed, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. So where did this concept come from that God is more of an it, or an Ein Sof, right? It cannot know human beings and still be God. Well, the concept probably took place and took root among the Alexandrian Jewish people of say the 4th century before the Common Era. More, if you really want to look at a date, right around the year 330 before the Common Era, during the time of Alexander the Great. During the time of Alexander the Great, there were more Jews living in Alexandria than in Jerusalem. So obviously, the theology of these Jewish people who were living in Alexandria obviously would have been influenced by Greek philosophy. And then you fast forward, of course, through the Gospels and, of course, the book of Acts, and you see that starting to take place. Martin, explaining Kabbalistic teaching, he says, this impersonal divine force, Ein Sof, this impersonal divine force splintered at creation and now inhabits everything. God is literally in all things. so he cannot be described. He has no limitations, and he only intermingles with the universe through the channels of the 10 Sephirot. Now, the 10 Sephirot are also referred to as the Tree of Life. And so the Kabbalists would teach that the Tree of Life reveals God's nature and plans for the world below. This is what God has permitted you to know. The Ein Sof is what you're not permitted to know. So there's a splinter there. It's almost as if there's two gods. If you are to pick up the book Kingdom of the Occult, Dr. Martin in there, he talks also about Simon. There was a Samaritan. Some say he was a Jewish sorcerer, but I think he was more of a Samaritan sorcerer named Simon. Well, historically, his name was Simon Magus. You see that in Acts 8, verse 9. And he was dabbling in this early form of mysticism and magic. Dr. Martin writes, he says, this religious mysticism, or Neoplatonism, focused on the influence of fate on human existence and the twin or dual nature of reality. The physical plane, a lower form of existence, and the divine reality, a higher form. The higher reality is linked to intelligence, transforming God into non-personal intellect. The lower level is physical, subject to fate, and thus considered inferior to the higher reality. Humans, as part of the physical realm, are separated from this ultimate intellect, but can ascend through the different levels by magical means and reincarnation, eventually reuniting with the ultimate intelligence in the higher reality. The link between Kabbalah and Neoplatonism is best seen in descriptions of God's nature and imagery of the levels of the cosmos. What is clear is that somehow the Torah of the Hellenistic Jews became intertwined with Plato's philosophy, melding into a syncretistic set of mystical beliefs. These beliefs evolved in several different philosophical directions, one of which is the magic-oriented teachings of Kabbalah. End quote. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are a number of different sects. We're not going to discuss all of them. I do want to touch on one of them before we close this session. The one I want to talk about, it will sound like an oxymoron to you. It's called Christian Kabbalah. Christian Kabbalah. And Martin explains, he says, it is believed that it moves into Europe through the migration of Jewish converts to Christianity. These converts reinterpreted Kabbalistic doctrines from a distinctly Christian perspective, linking Jesus Christ, his atonement, and his resurrection to the 10 Sephirot. Jewish leaders from the Middle Ages, clear down through the 19th century, were outraged by the theft of secret Jewish mysticism, but powerless to strip it. End quote. And you would think, yeah, that would kind of annoy them. How could you take our teachings that were supposedly handed down orally, centuries and centuries, until they were finally written down in the 13th century, and you're taking that and you're actually attributing it to the Christian Bible and what they believe? So by the time this Christian Kabbalah, if you want to call it that, by the time you get to the 17th, 18th centuries, Christian Kabbalah had certainly spread across Europe. And what were they teaching? Well, it's going to sound somewhat familiar, because what they were teaching then is what is also currently finding its way through Messianic congregations and the Hebrew Roots movement. It's going to sound familiar. That if you take the Tetragrammaton, the Yod He Vav He, which, again, we do not know the vowels. We do not know the vowels. But they will teach that if you can pronounce the name, the divine name of God, you will then have access to magical powers. It's like a magical formula. If you can ascertain the divine name, in essence, what you've done is you've let the genie out of the bottle. And God becomes your genie because you can pronounce his name. And then you can have God do whatever you want. Now, where is that being taught? How is it finding its way into Messianic congregations? It's called the Sacred Name Movement. Sacred Name. Well, how does this work? Well, in the Sacred Name Movement, as well as taking letters, and what you do is you take the Hebrew letters, and Hebrew letters are looked at as being literary and mathematical. So in essence, what Kabbalah is teaching is that there's a deeper meaning hidden in words. There's a deeper meaning hidden in certain phrases or certain verses. The study of this is called gematria. Gematria matches numeric value of words or phrases. And what will happen is, what they'll teach is that if you can tap into this and you can figure out these numbers, and the numbers like Aleph would be a 1 and Bet would be a 2, and if you put the letters together and they formulate numbers, that there's a deeper meaning to it. There's hidden truths in there. Divine energies are in there. The most well-known example of this is Jacob's ladder. So in the Hebrew they will say that the word for ladder has a certain numerical value. Well, then they also look and say, well, what a coincidence that Sinai has the same numerical value, the Hebrew word. So if ladder and Sinai have the same numerical value, Kabbalah will teach that the way to get to heaven is through the Torah. See? Or Sinai. Torah was given to us from Sinai, and so that's the ladder in a way to get to heaven, or the divine. Torah study, or I should say Torah observance and things like that. So in essence, gematria is like a decoder ring. You apply numbers to words. You apply numbers to phrases. And if you do so, Kabbalah will teach that it will produce for you all kinds of truths that if you just opened up the Torah, you would never see them. And if you can open up the Torah and now you are pulling out all these truths and all these secret meanings and everything like that, there are energies, divine energies located in the Torah that you don't have access to right now, but you can. Well, we're going to pause at that point, and in our next session we'll pick up with another sect of Kabbalah. And that other sect that we'll be looking at is called Hollywood Kabbalah. And we'll be learning a little bit more about that in our next session.